This photo, I just want you to focus on the ceiling. This area here was the previous dry section. Just as money makes money, so carbon makes carbon. A resilient landscape full of carbon compounds is more likely to promote germination. Germination is necessary for future carbon introduction. The story behind these figures is that after that same rainfall I was referring to before, I went around with a piece of high tensile running wire and I started poking it into the landscape to see how important plants were in the particular landscape that I'd suddenly bought in the short term. Now in the bare soil, this is strictly bare, the fencing wire went in 150 millimetres or 6 inches. Single perennial plants, 8 inches or 200 millimetres, and in the grass clumps it went down 18 inches or 450. I just showed this photo and these figures to show how important it is to have healthy grasses growing in there. Now the wick effect is actually much more important in this landscape than the litter effect. And the reason I say it is that in these dry times you often don't have any litter on the ground. But when you get a sharp storm and you've got an old butt sitting in the soil, the water will run across the landscape and go straight into that perennial grass butt. So they're absolutely critical to have there, even if the country's bare. When livestock eat the top half, after plants have been allowed to grow, you still have the roots left in the soil. So I'm really saying you need to let the landscape grow, and then when you consume it, you've still got the advantage of the rest. Now, lifting the wind. It's another very important one. Think about why clothes dry on a clothesline on a windy day. The reason is that you've got the moist garment on the line, and then moisture comes out into the air right beside the clothing garment, and then it reaches equilibrium and no more water comes out of the garment. But when the wind blows that moist little bit of air away, it's replaced by dry air, and so then the water comes out again. So it's a wind that keeps replacing the air quicker, which dries the clothes quicker. It's the same effect in the landscape if you haven't got any coverage on it to keep the wind off the ground. Shading is the other one I mentioned, and I'll just relate a story down in Brisbane. Recently, it would have been about September I suppose, I was driving from east to west and all of a sudden the penny dropped on me. It hadn't rained in Brisbane for quite a long time, and all the footpaths on the left hand side of the road were green, and the ones on the left were all dry and tinder. The ones on the right were basically green. Now when you think about me just driving straight forward with the sun out on the right hand side because it was that time of year, there was nothing grey in the middle of the road, the sun just kept shining down onto the grass on the left hand side of the road. There was no protection. On the other side of the road, all the trees and all the gardens of the houses were protecting him, and so there we were looking at two equal landscapes, and the shading was the difference between greenness and dryness. If plants are not allowed to grow after rain, then there is not a flow of carbon to construct the structural aspect of carbon. These three structural factors contribute to water use efficiency. This is because more water leaves the landscape via plants growing instead of leaving via runoff and evaporation. Resilience to this point has been linked to plant health, soil health, and the structural role of carbon. Another aspect of resilience to reduce the effect of a variable climate relies on more perennials in the paddock. Perennials can respond to isolated falls of rain, while annuals can't. Perennials can be both grasses and edible shrubs. Some people are taking the perennial approach to another level by planting leukina and edible shrubs like saltbush. These hardy perennials reduce the impact of a variable climate by transferring the use of rainfall further into the future. Their deeper roots are able to utilise moisture that is not available to the grasses. By producing longer term protein, leukina and saltbush reduce methane emissions per kg of production. If time runs out, well, you're welcome to ask me this later. These are the three things that resilience achieves. I'm just running short of time. Stating the obvious, they do increase the profit by having a resilient landscape. Things just grow better. I'd now like to go into pasture rest and resilience. Now down to the basics. How to best manage carbon flows. We discussed earlier that photosynthesis is the only way that carbon can move from the atmosphere to the landscape. Given that it is moisture that promotes photosynthesis, then it is moisture that promotes the introduction of carbon. If you think about it logically, the bulk of the carbon enters the landscape in the short period immediately following rain. This highlights the need to focus our management around this point in time. This is when the carbon arrives. Management is about taking advantage of as many opportunities as possible. Because there is no pattern to when rain arrives, in other words, when carbon arrives, the main message today is that pasture rest is timing, not time. Basing resting decisions on a certain period of time is no guarantee that carbon will arrive. If you read my book, you'll appreciate that this is not an attack on cell grazers. One highly respected cell grazer, who locks up his cells for 120 days, is the first to admit that the bulk of increased production is driven by the short period following rain. His case is that the animals are usually not there when the rain arrives. My point is, it doesn't matter how you get the animals off the pasture, but you do have to get them off. Timing has another aspect. Water also activates the soil microbes to release nitrogen and other nutrients, as well as growth promotants to help plants grow. Timing is the important issue because both plants and soil microbes are activated by moisture. We have to act when they are both working together as a team. Finally, timing relates to when the soluble carbon from photosynthesis is being released to the fungi on the roots. This allows the fungi to reach out and source extra nutrients for the plants. And if you speak to Tony later, this is also a way of how you increase the longer term carbon in the soil. 5 minutes? Removing animals for an extended period of time is positive for maintaining ground cover. However, it has little to do with carbon introduction. The introduction of carbon is a separate issue to the consumption of carbon stocks. They are both important issues, but they are separate issues. Consumption when plants are not growing relates more to the structural role of carbon. Now for the outcomes of rest. The South African scientists I've dealt with are very focused on rest after rainfall. While I was visiting their country, they explained that with average pastures, 3 to 8 weeks of rest after rain can see an increase in pasture production of 50 to 80%. At the time when pastures are emerging from dormancy, there is a potential for so much lost production. The basis of the carbon grazing principle is that pasture rest is timing, not time. I refer you to the poster outside which explains all these principles. Carbon grazing is 4 to 6 weeks rest immediately after rain. The period does not commence until the plants actually start growing. There's a practical aspect. You've also got to find time to shift them. Also, it is important to not get caught up on the exact time, as factors like temperature influence the necessary time required. The principle of carbon grazing is strategic or tactical rest and is based on the premise that nature does not have a predictable pattern. Carbon grazing is not based on what might happen, but what is about to happen. I want to reinforce that carbon grazing is not a new land management system. It is a general principle. It is about maximising carbon flows. The practical aspect of seeing pasture rest as timing instead of time is that you only need to find a home for the animals for a short period of time. It is possible without selling them, as the handout explains. I'd just like to very quickly touch on greenhouse and resilience.